So we're leading up to 5 o'clock. So we have about 15 minutes, and I'm Sudhir Krishnaswamy. I teach at NUJS. My role on this panel, self-appointed role, because I came very late, came back very late to Venki as to what I'd like to cover. And let me try and explain it as I go along. The way I titled it is that I said I'll talk about software patents in the commons. That's the whole seminar. And I just appended a critical note, and I'm going to try and think about what problems we have in relating the two concepts, and hopefully with some insight into practical application. In 2008, many of the people in this room met in Bangalore, and the title of the conference, I don't remember exactly, but it might have been similar. It might have said Knowledge Commons. And one of the key themes of that conference in 2008 was to discuss software patents. And one of the interesting things that came up at the conference was to ask why there isn't a software patent opposition strategy, much the same way as there is in the pharmaceutical sector. 2 years on, I think it's good news to report that good progress has been made. At least some of the groups in this room have already filed such oppositions, or are well underway into filing these oppositions. But as of today, we still don't have a body of case law, either at the patent office or in the courts, which establishes. We have a pharmaceutical case law which focuses on a great deal on the procedures of pre-grant opposition, but we don't have a software case law. And so it's still new territory. So the standard stock in trade of the law professor is to work through the case law. So I don't have that option, easy option in this case. Has statutory law changed very much in the last 2 years? Not really. We have that draft patent manual going through the system, and as Prabir mentioned and Pranesh mentioned, we hear that there might be a new patent manual, and so that might give us some movement. There is a patent manual for applicants which doesn't shift the ground tremendously. So there's no great shift in the legal ground. So my sense is that approaching today's seminar and presentation, I thought about what would be useful to say, and it struck me that something that is very relevant to the patent opposition strategies, which would help us evaluate that phrase. We're still stuck with the phrase computer programs per se. What do we make of it? And I thought to myself, how would I think about it, just abstractly? And I said, maybe three strategies present themselves. We could think theoretically on a commons-based objection to software patents, right? And we could write these out in the patent oppositions that we file, and we somehow have to articulate that commons-based objection in the language of the statute and the language of Indian law. That's one option. Option B is to do a comparative law argument against excessive patenting of computer software. And here, and that option is open, and I'll just try and explain what I'm going to do with it. And the third is you make rank policy-based objections and say that it's bad because patent terms and the nature of the market life of software don't meet, or it doesn't meet the incentive argument, some such thing. And I think Pranesh has done the third. He's done a fair bit of the policy-based objections to why software patents shouldn't be granted. For my part, and in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the first two. I'm going to try to think through what it means to have a commons-based objection in the language of Indian patent law, and I'm going to very briefly talk about comparative law, looking at the US position primarily, but I mean, I have more of an anecdote than the law, because I don't think that there's I don't have anything remarkably new to say about the development in US law, and there's adequate literature on that question. So I think Abhijit Sen in session 1 spoke about thinking about commons and the public goods, right? And he used both of those approaches. And the way I think he set it up was that he said that commons were the sort of pre-existing commons. They already existed. And to my mind, in ecological history, the forests and lakes are seen as these sort of pre-existing commons. In the knowledge industries, I think traditional knowledge is seen as one of these pre-existing commons. You don't create it. And Abhijit sought to contrast it with public goods and so new drugs. They have to be created. They may not already be there. You know? And he sought to talk about the different structures that preserve commons and create public goods and the role of government and so on. And I think that's, I'm just going to use that as a sort of point to jump off, because I want to talk about the commons part of it. You know, why does he think about commons in that way? Is that the way we should think about commons in the context of computer programs? And luckily, to aid me is a very good 2010 Cornell Law Review Symposium in a multidisciplinary context, thinking about what would be an acceptable definition of the commons. As economists would use it, as lawyers might use it, as political scientists might use it, and so on. And there is that literature. And what I'm just going to take one part of that literature and the defining the commons. And it's useful that you can think of the commons in at least three ways. As resources that are somehow intrinsically better governed by a commons, right? Or you could think of it purely as a resource management strategy. It's resource neutral. You could have a commons on culture, you could have a commons on the lakes, and you could have a commons on software. There's nothing intrinsic about the subject of the commons. And the third is to see it as an institutional arrangement or a sort of community normative system, again, which is resource neutral. What's interesting across that symposium is that most people veer around to the argument that the first of these, a resource-based definition of the commons, is the weakest of the three, which is that there is nothing intrinsic about A or B resource that makes it more amenable or better suited to the commons. And this is it slightly runs against the grain of a software exceptional argument. You know, let's say that there's something about software or about digital goods that makes it suitable to be called a commons. And my sense is it's not like a blanket rejection of that proposition. It's just it's a relative weightage. And I think what's interesting in the Indian context is that if we think of the Patents Act and the nature of the objection, why do we not want software patents? What kind of arguments we can make? We have to start with the idea that we've adopted Article 27 of TRIPS more or less in our Act, where we adopt a technological neutrality as far as subject matter, but we have an exclusion clause, and that's Section 3. And the algorithms and computer programs find themselves in Section 3. So how do we understand it? I mean, thinking analogically, is computer programs like traditional knowledge, which is also in Section 3, and I think James mentioned it. You know, is it like traditional knowledge in that it's very character as a resource. There's something about the resource that makes it suited to a commons. And that kind of argument can be made. And I saw Pranesh, actually, I just heard him right now, making some of those arguments, and they've been made by others today. Or is the argument something specific about software, patents, meaning that there is something in the nature of software or its existing models of institutional arrangements to govern software that makes it more amenable to a commons, right? So just look at what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to see which of these ideas of the commons do we invoke when we look at Section 3 and the exclusion of computer software. You know, one might say, what difference does it make? I think it makes a lot of difference in the kinds of arguments you use in a patent objection style proceedings, because you patent opposition style proceedings, because then it might be useful if agreement were possible that the intrinsic character of the good kind of argument, we can evaluate that. Do we need to run that argument in the courts? Is it the best argument, the analogy to traditional knowledge, or is that best kept aside and arguments made about institutional arrangements, about the nature of software and the nature of its production, are those likely to have more both theoretical coherence and traction on an opposition proceeding? So and I'm not going to elaborate why software contracts, software production is amenable to a resource management system of the commons, because people before me have explained that in far greater detail about what the history of free and open source software is is the case. I'll just leave it at that. So the other way of thinking about it, and I think this is, I would say, more amenable to comparative law, is to think about this not as a subject matter exclusion, but as a patent law restriction, which is that patent law works better when it deals with certain kinds of things, not abstract ideas. This is not about the kind of subject matter which is better excluded because of commons possibilities, but just this idea, abstract idea, algorithm exclusion, just as a way that patent law, as a matter of principle, excludes that, right? And how would we think about that? I think the US case law develops this view. It develops the view as to why abstract ideas should be kept out, and why that's not the role of the patent system. And we may, in a sense, use comparative law to use that kind of argument and feed that into the Indian system. And so let me just turn to that second side and look at how we might make, what can we learn in the recent US case law? What are we going to learn on interpreting this phrase, computer programs per se? So earlier today, some of the speakers took us through State Street Bank. So one of the ways of doing it, and it was very clear in that patent absurdity video, that a useful, concrete, and tangible result is the additional feature of a computer program that makes it patentable. Is option A, which at a certain point in time was the US position, and which gets changed with the federal court decision in Bilski to a machine or transformation test, right? And so maybe the argument is not this, it's not the big option, which is to say it's excluded completely because of the nature of Section 3, but to see it as simply from comparative law, we try and learn what kind of qualifier should be attached to computer programs, and say that computer programs with this qualifier may be patentable, but others may not. And the US Supreme Court hasn't changed, it doesn't establish this machine test as being the only way to judge computer software. And so in that sense, and most commentators say that it just leaves that question relatively open. And so maybe in our patent opposition strategies, there might be a question of choosing which kind of qualifier should be attached to these computer software programs that may then make them patentable. So this is broadly put. What is interesting, and I said I have more of an anecdote on the comparative law, is that I was just reading the amicus brief of Ananda Chakrabarti, who, with I think it was some Stanford Center, presents an amicus brief to the court. And what's interesting about the amicus brief is the strong connection that the brief seeks to make between biotech patents, the future of the biotech industry, and with return on investment calculations in biotech, and it tries to make that and say that what is the case with the biotech industry is the case with software patents, and it's a good enough reason for the court to sustain to have these fields as patentable subject matter.
Chakrabarti of Diamond.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that Chakrabarti, and he also makes the argument, and I think this is an argument that's surely going to find its way into the Indian courts, which is that that the per se point is that it's not a patentable subject matter point at all.